scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke was a constant companion in the spring of 1849. On my small farm in Ohio, the rhythms of life felt timeless, dictated by the turning seasons. We toiled the land, traded our crops, and believed in a future built on honest labor. News from the bustling factories of the north often reached us, the whirring of looms, the clang of ironworks, signs of a rapidly changing world. Down south, however, the news carried a different scent, the heavy, cloying sweetness of cotton and the bitter tang of injustice. For decades, the invisible fault line running through our young nation had been deepening. It wasn't just a line on a map, it was a chasm of ideals. Up north, in places like Boston and Philadelphia, the industrial gears turned faster, fueled by immigrant labor and innovation. We spoke of progress, of individual liberty, of the moral imperative to abolish the stain of slavery. Our economy thrived on diverse industries, on wages, on free labor. But south of the Mason-Dixon line, an entirely different world flourished. Vast plantations, built on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children, dominated the landscape. The wealth of the South, the very foundation of its society, was inextricably tied to this brutal institution. They called it their peculiar institution, a way of life, a system essential to their agrarian economy. They argued for states' rights, for self-determination, but at the heart of their fervent defense lay the right to own another human being. The political landscape was a constant, tense negotiation, a series of fragile compromises designed to delay the inevitable. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, each a desperate attempt to balance the power between free states and slave states as the nation expanded westward. Every new territory that joined the Union sparked fierce, often violent debates. Would Kansas be free or slave? Would California tip the scales? The questions were no longer abstract. They were becoming personal, threatening to tear families apart. I remember the passionate speeches of abolitionists read in hushed tones in our local newspaper, speaking of the inherent evil of human bondage. And I remember the equally fervent defenses from Southern politicians, decrying Northern interference, painting us as meddlers intent on destroying their way of life. The language grew sharper, more inflamed. Neighbors, once united by the shared experience of building a nation, now eyed each other with suspicion, seeing not just fellow Americans, but enemies of their deepest convictions. The air, though seemingly calm, was thick with unspoken tension, a rising hum of discord that promised something far more violent than political debate. We were a nation growing, but also a nation slowly, inexorably pulling apart, each side convinced of its own righteousness, each side blind to the other's pain. The seeds of a great, terrible conflict were being sown, and soon the harvest would be blood. The fragile peace of the 1850s was a thin veneer over a boiling cauldron. Every legislative act, every court ruling seemed to chip away at the nation's unity, pushing us closer to the brink. The Missouri Compromise, designed to balance the scales between free and slave states, was shattered by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It decreed that residents of new territories, like Kansas, could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, a concept dubbed popular sovereignty. This was no compromise. It was an open invitation to chaos. Suddenly, Kansas became a battleground, not just of ideas, but of blood. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions poured into the territory, each determined to outvote, outfight, or simply outlast the other. Settlers, often armed to the teeth, clashed in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Houses burned, men died, and the very notion of peaceful democratic process was incinerated in the flames of partisan rage. The lines were being drawn not just between North and South, but within communities, sometimes within families. The echoes of that violence reached Washington. I remember reading about Senator Charles Sumner, an abolitionist, being savagely beaten on the Senate floor by a Southern congressman. The halls of power, once sacred to reasoned debate, were becoming stained with violence. It felt like the very fabric of our republic was tearing apart, thread by thread. Then came the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857, a landmark ruling that sent shockwaves across the nation far beyond the courtroom. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom after living in free territories. The Supreme Court, dominated by Southern justices, ruled against him. The verdict declared that black people, enslaved or free, were not and could not be citizens. Even worse, it stated that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any territory, effectively making slavery legal everywhere. For us in the North, it was an outrageous blow, a betrayal of the ideals our nation was founded upon. It felt as if the highest court in the land had declared slavery to be not just legal, but an untouchable right, expandable across the entire continent. For the South, it was a vindication, a legal triumph. But it cemented the North's resolve that the issue could no longer be contained or compromised away. The chasm had widened into an abyss. The final spark, perhaps the most incendiary, came with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. An ardent abolitionist, Brown believed that only violence could end slavery. He led a small band, including his sons, in an audacious raid on a federal armory, hoping to seize weapons and arm enslaved people for a massive uprising. The raid failed spectacularly. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged. For the North, many saw Brown as a martyr, a man willing to die for a righteous cause. For the South, he was the ultimate terrorist, proof that the North was actively plotting to incite slave rebellions and destroy their way of life through bloodshed. His gallows became a symbol either of the fight for freedom or of existential threat. The air now crackled with more than just tension. It was filled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the undeniable rumble of an approaching storm. The time for compromise was over. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the very soul of the nation. The year 1860 arrived draped in an almost unbearable tension. The nation felt like a tightly stretched bowstring ready to snap. The presidential election that year wasn't just another political contest, it was a referendum on the very soul of America. 4 major candidates vied for the highest office, but the true battle was between 2 opposing visions of the Republic, primarily focused on the expansion of slavery. In the North, the Republican Party, a relatively young force, rallied behind Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. His stance was clear: no expansion of slavery into new territories. He wasn't an abolitionist in the radical sense, not advocating for immediate forced emancipation where it already existed, but his opposition to its spread was unequivocal. For the South, Lincoln's very name was a clarion call of threat, a symbol of everything they feared: federal power encroaching on their rights, an attack on their entire way of life. The Democratic Party, once the nation's dominant political force, fractured along sectional lines. Southern Democrats, unwilling to compromise on the issue of slavery's expansion, nominated John C. Breckinridge. Northern Democrats, clinging to the idea of popular sovereignty, supported Stephen A. Douglas. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged, hoping to paper over the cracks with appeals to unity, but their efforts seemed tragically naive in the face of such deep divisions. The election results were a grim confirmation of the nation's profound split. Lincoln won, securing the presidency with only about 40% of the popular vote, but with a clear majority in the Electoral College, largely due to overwhelming support in the North. His name didn't even appear on the ballot in many Southern states. It was a victory without Southern consent, a political earthquake that reverberated from Washington, D.C. to every plantation and farm in the South. For the Southern states, Lincoln's election was the final straw, the ultimate act of perceived aggression. Their long-held threats of secession, the right to withdraw from the Union, now became terrifyingly real. They saw Lincoln's victory as a direct assault on their sovereignty, their economy, and their peculiar institution. It was proof, in their eyes, that the federal government was now irrevocably controlled by hostile forces. On December 20th, 1860, just weeks after the election, South Carolina led the charge, becoming the first state to formally secede from the Union. Others quickly followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, forming a new nation called the Confederate States of America by February 1861. They established their own government, wrote their own constitution, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The Stars and Stripes were replaced by the Stars and Bars across the South. The reaction in the North was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and growing anger. President James Buchanan, still in office during this perilous transition period, proved indecisive, unable or unwilling to stem the tide of secession. Lincoln, awaiting his inauguration in March, spoke of the importance of preserving the Union, of the impossibility of states simply leaving at will. His words, though conciliatory in tone, were firm in their message. The Union was perpetual. As winter turned to spring, the nation stood on the precipice. Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, became the ultimate flashpoint, a symbol of federal authority isolated within newly declared Confederate territory. The tension was palpable, a suffocating blanket over the land. The lines of division were no longer theoretical or political. They were becoming stark, physical boundaries, soon to be defended by armed men. The choice had been made, and the terrifying consequences were about to unfold. The spring of 1861 brought with it not the promise of renewal, but the ominous stillness before a storm. All eyes were on Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, now the heart of the newly formed Confederacy. Major Robert Anderson, a loyal Union officer, commanded a small garrison, isolated and increasingly vulnerable. Surrounding him, Confederate batteries bristled, their cannons aimed squarely at the fort. It was a standoff, a tense game of chess where one wrong move would ignite a war. President Lincoln, now inaugurated, faced an impossible dilemma: resupply Fort Sumter, and he risked being seen as the aggressor, potentially pushing more southern states into secession. Withdraw, and he would concede federal authority, acknowledging the Confederacy's legitimacy. He chose a middle path, to send supplies but no reinforcements, clearly signaling his intent was not to provoke. But for the Confederacy, the mere presence of a Union fort in their sovereign territory was an intolerable affront. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender. Anderson refused. The final ultimatum was delivered on April 11th. When Anderson still held firm, the Confederate commander had his orders. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the first shot was fired. A mortar round arched across the pre-dawn sky, exploding over Fort Sumter. It was not a call for surrender, but an act of war. The bombardment began in earnest, a deafening cacophony of cannon fire and bursting shells. The small Union garrison, outmatched and outgunned, endured the relentless barrage for 34 hours. Buildings inside the fort caught fire. The flagpole was shot down and smoke choked the air. Yet Major Anderson's men, incredibly, suffered no fatalities during the bombardment itself. On April 13th, with his fort ablaze and supplies exhausted, Major Anderson had no choice but to surrender. He lowered the American flag, which was then honorably saluted, and evacuated his men. The Confederates took possession of Fort Sumter. The Union had lost a fort, but the Confederacy had gained something far more profound: a war. News of Fort Sumter spread like wildfire across the nation. The South erupted in celebrations, cheers, and declarations of victory. Volunteers flocked to recruiting stations, eager to defend their newly declared nation. In the North, the reaction was a furious wave of indignation. The attack on Fort Sumter was seen as an act of treason, an unprovoked assault on the United States. Lincoln's carefully worded calls for unity now transformed into a resolute demand for action. On April 15th, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This act forced the remaining undecided slave states to choose a side. Virginia, a pivotal state with deep ties to both North and South, quickly seceded, followed by Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. This brought the total number of Confederate states to 11. Crucially, states like Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, though slaveholding, remained in the Union, albeit with deep internal divisions that often erupted into localized violence. The lines were now irrevocably drawn. The political arguments, the compromises, the tense standoffs, all were over. The nation was undeniably at war. Brothers against brothers, families against families. The roar of cannons over Charleston Harbor was not just the sound of a fort falling. It was the chilling prelude to a conflict that would tear the country apart, reshape its identity, and forever stain its soil with blood. The optimism of a quick victory held by many on both sides was a fragile delusion soon to be shattered by the brutal reality of total war. The cannons of Fort Sumter had barely ceased their roar when the nation plunged headlong into a frantic race to build armies. President Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers was met with a surge of patriotic fervor in the North. Young men, fired by idealism and a belief in a swift victory, lined up to enlist. From farms and factories they came, eager to defend the Union. Drill sergeants barked orders. New uniforms, often ill-fitting, were issued, and the chaotic process of transforming civilians into soldiers began. In the South, a similar surge of enthusiasm swept through the new Confederacy. Men flocked to defend their states and their way of life, convinced their superior martial spirit would quickly humble the industrial North. They believed in the righteousness of their cause, self-determination, and the protection of their institutions. The air was thick with the sounds of marching boots, band music, and the clatter of muskets being drilled. Both sides expected a short, glorious conflict, perhaps a few decisive battles, and then a quick return home. The reality, however, was far grimmer. The first major clash at Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861, just miles from Washington, D.C., was a brutal awakening. What started as a chaotic, almost picnic-like affair for onlookers devolved into a bloody, disorganized rout for the Union forces. Confederate troops, bolstered by the defiant stand of General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, held their ground and then pushed the Federals back in disarray towards the capital. The defeat sent shockwaves through the North, shattering the illusion of an easy victory. It was clear now, this would be a long, arduous, and deadly war. Following Bull Run, both sides dug in literally and figuratively. General George B. McClellan, charismatic but cautious, was appointed to command the Union's main force, the Army of the Potomac. He set about meticulously organizing and training his raw recruits, determined to create a professional fighting machine. Meanwhile, the Confederacy, under the brilliant tactical leadership of Robert E. Lee, began to consolidate its defenses and exploit the advantage of fighting on home ground. As 1861 drew to a close, the focus shifted beyond the immediate capital. The Western theater, often overshadowed by the drama in Virginia, began to emerge as strategically vital. Control of the great rivers, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, was crucial for both logistics and cutting the Confederacy in half. Here, a relatively unknown Union general named Ulysses S. Grant began to make his mark. Unlike McClellan's cautious approach, Grant was a man of action, direct and persistent. Minor skirmishes dotted the landscape from the mountains of West Virginia to the plains of Missouri. Naval actions began to pick up, with the Union establishing a blockade of southern ports, slowly strangling the Confederacy's access to vital supplies and foreign trade. The first year of the war, though marked by only one major land battle in the East, was defined by the sobering realization that this would be a prolonged struggle, a test of will and endurance for a nation tragically divided. The grand illusions of summer had given way to the grim realities of a cold winter, and the promise of more bloodshed to come. While General McClellan meticulously drilled his Army of the Potomac outside Washington, D.C., preparing for a grand, decisive push, the war's true momentum in early 1862 began to shift westward. The vast expanse of the Western Theater, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, held the strategic key to victory. Control of its mighty rivers, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, and the Mississippi, meant the ability to slice the Confederacy in two, choke off its supply lines, and open avenues deep into its heartland. Here, a new kind of Union general was emerging, one distinctly different from the cautious, politically astute commanders of the East. Ulysses S. Grant, often dismissed as a quiet, unassuming man with a checkered past, possessed a relentless will and a direct, uncompromising approach to warfare. While others strategized about glorious maneuvers, Grant focused on results, finding the enemy and hitting them hard. His first significant moves were against Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862, two crucial Confederate strongholds guarding the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Working in close coordination with Union gunboats, Grant launched swift, decisive attacks. Fort Henry fell quickly to naval bombardment. Fort Donelson, however, proved a tougher nut to crack. The Confederates, after an initial attempt to break out, found themselves cornered. When the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant famously replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." The demand earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The fall of Fort Henry and Donelson was a seismic shock to the Confederacy. It opened up vast swaths of Tennessee to Union forces, provided crucial river access, and shattered Confederate morale in the West. Grant, now a national hero, pushed relentlessly south, demonstrating a new aggressive style of warfare that would eventually define the Union's path to victory. Simultaneously, the Union Navy was making significant gains along the lower Mississippi River. A daring operation led by Admiral David Farragut saw Union ships run past Confederate forts and capture New Orleans in April 1862. The fall of the Confederacy's largest city and most vital port was another devastating blow, a testament to the Union's growing naval power and its ability to execute combined land and sea operations. These victories in the West, though sometimes overshadowed by the looming battles in Virginia, were strategically far more impactful in the early war. They disrupted Confederate supply lines, eroded their territory, and most importantly, brought to the forefront a new breed of determined Union commanders like Grant. While the Eastern Theater seemed locked in a stalemate, the successes in the West were carving out a path toward ultimate Union victory, slowly but surely tightening the noose around the Confederacy. The illusion of a quick Confederate triumph was fading, replaced by the grim reality of a two-front war where the North was beginning to assert its numerical and industrial superiority. The early Union victories in the Western Theater, spearheaded by General Grant, had pushed Confederate forces deep into Mississippi. By early April 1862, Grant's Army of the Tennessee was encamped near Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, close to a small country meeting house called Shiloh. He was awaiting reinforcements from General Don Carlos Buell's army before launching a final push against Corinth, a vital Confederate railroad hub. Yet, the Confederate command, under Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, had other plans. They decided to strike first. The dawn of April 6, 1862, broke with a sudden, thunderous roar. The Confederates launched a massive surprise attack, crashing into the unsuspecting Union camps. Many Federal soldiers were still cooking breakfast, their rifles unloaded, caught completely off guard. The initial hours were pure chaos. Union lines crumpled under the ferocity of the assault, men scrambling for their lives, abandoning their tents and equipment. The element of surprise was almost absolute, pushing Grant's forces to the brink of collapse. The fighting quickly devolved into a horrifying close-quarters struggle amidst the dense woods and ravines. Artillery ripped through trees, turning the forests into splintered death traps. Muskets roared, bayonets flashed, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the smoke-filled air. The day was marked by desperate Union stands, most famously at a sunken road that became known as the Hornet's Nest. Here, Union soldiers, though completely surrounded, held out for hours against wave after wave of Confederate assaults, inflicting terrible casualties before finally being overwhelmed and captured. The sheer scale of the carnage was unprecedented. Both sides fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The blood ran in rivulets, staining the spring earth. Amidst the chaos, tragedy struck the Confederate command.
General Albert Sidney Johnston, widely considered one of the South's most promising generals, was mortally wounded, bleeding to death in a ravine after being shot in the leg. His death was a massive blow to Confederate morale and strategy. As dusk fell, after a full day of relentless fighting, the Union lines had been pushed back almost to the Tennessee River. Many thought the Federal Army was broken. General Beauregard, now in command, believed victory was assured and called off the Confederate attack, intending to deliver the final blow in the morning. However, Grant, despite the immense pressure and the day's devastating losses, remained resolute. He rallied his shattered regiments, brought up fresh divisions, and, crucially, received reinforcements from Buell's army during the night. The morning of April 7th dawned to a counterattack by the revitalized Union forces. The battle raged again, just as fiercely as the day before, often over the same blood-soaked ground. By afternoon, the Confederates, exhausted and outmatched, were forced to retreat back to Corinth. The Union had held the field, but at a staggering cost. The Battle of Shiloh claimed over 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, from both sides, making it the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point. Shiloh was a brutal revelation. It shattered any lingering illusions of a short, glorious war. It showed both North and South the terrifying efficiency with which their countrymen could kill each other. And it set a grim precedent for the scale of suffering and death that would define the next 3 years of conflict. The nation was now fully awake to the horrors of the war it had unleashed. While the armies clashed on land, a silent, relentless war was being waged at sea. From the outset, the Union's strategy included the Anaconda Plan, a naval blockade designed to strangle the Confederacy's economy. The idea was simple: cut off the South's access to vital European supplies, weapons, medicine, manufactured goods, and prevent its cotton, its economic lifeblood, from reaching foreign markets. But imposing a blockade on over 3,500 miles of coastline, dotted with numerous ports and inlets, was a monumental task. The Union Navy, though larger, had to rapidly expand and adapt. Old sailing ships were converted, new steam-powered vessels were built, and a vast fleet began to patrol the Confederate coast. Blockade runners, swift, low-profile ships attempted to slip through the Union lines, often under the cover of darkness. It was a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game. Success meant fortunes. Capture meant ruin. While not always airtight, the blockade slowly, inexorably began to take its toll, causing shortages and economic hardship throughout the South. But the naval war wasn't just about blockades. It was about to witness a revolution in naval warfare itself. A clash of giants unlike anything seen before. The Confederacy, desperate to break the Union stranglehold, had begun a daring project. They salvaged the hull of the USS Merrimack, a Union frigate scuttled in Norfolk, and rebuilt it with a sloping iron casemate, turning it into an armored behemoth, the CSS Virginia. This was their answer to the wooden navies of the world, a weapon designed to smash through the Union blockade. On March 8, 1862, the Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads, Virginia, a terrifying sight to the wooden Union warships. Its iron plating shrugged off cannonballs like pebbles. It rammed and sank the USS Cumberland and set the USS Congress ablaze, sending panic through the Union fleet. It was a devastating debut, proving that the age of wooden warships was over. The Union's blockading fleet was in grave danger.
However, the Union was not unprepared for such an innovation. They had secretly been building their own ironclad, a radically different design. The USS Monitor, a revolutionary vessel designed by John Erickson, arrived in Hampton Roads just hours after the Virginia's rampage. It was a low-slung, cheesebox on a raft design, featuring a revolving turret with 2 heavy guns, a truly novel concept. The morning of March 9, 1862, witnessed the historic Battle of Hampton Roads, the first clash between 2 ironclad warships. For hours, the Monitor and the Virginia pounded each other, their cannonballs bouncing harmlessly off their armored hides. It was a bizarre, almost surreal duel, a glimpse into the future of naval power. Neither ship could decisively defeat the other, but the Monitor succeeded in its primary objective. It protected the rest of the Union fleet and preserved the blockade. Though the battle was a stalemate, its implications were profound. It instantly rendered every wooden warship in the world obsolete and fundamentally changed naval strategy forever. The age of ironclads had begun, and with it, a new dimension of the war was opened, proving that innovation, just as much as brute force, would shape the ultimate outcome of this brutal conflict. The sea, like the land, was becoming a stage for unprecedented devastation. While Grant was making strides in the West, the Union's main effort in the East centered on capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital. President Lincoln, frustrated by the lack of decisive action, pushed his reluctant commander, Major General George B. McClellan, to advance. McClellan, meticulous to a fault, had spent months organizing and drilling his massive Army of the Potomac, turning it into a formidable fighting force. But his cautious nature bordered on paralysis. Instead of a direct overland march, McClellan devised the Peninsula Campaign. In March 1862, he transported his vast army, over 100,000 men strong, by sea to the Virginia Peninsula, aiming to bypass Confederate defenses and strike directly at Richmond. It was a daring maneuver, designed to be the decisive blow that would end the war. For weeks, his army inched forward, encountering minimal resistance but often bogged down by heavy rains and McClellan's own extreme caution, which led him to constantly overestimate Confederate strength. The Confederate forces defending Richmond were initially outnumbered, but their commander, General Joseph E. Johnston, conducted a skillful delaying action. Then, in late May, Johnston was wounded, and Robert E. Lee, a quiet, dignified Virginian who had initially served as Jefferson Davis's military advisor, was placed in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. It was a pivotal moment that would dramatically change the course of the war in the East. Lee, unlike McClellan, was aggressive and daring. He immediately grasped the opportunity to seize the initiative. While McClellan waited for reinforcements and meticulously planned his next move, Lee, with a smaller force, launched a series of bold, complex maneuvers designed to confuse and outflank the Union Army. He called upon Stonewall Jackson to execute a brilliant diversionary campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, threatening Washington, D.C., and drawing away Union troops intended for McClellan. Then, starting in late June, Lee launched a series of fierce engagements known as the 7 Days Battles. Over the course of a week, Lee repeatedly attacked McClellan's larger but more cautious army, pushing the Federals back, sometimes at a terrible cost to his own forces. Battles like Gaines's Mill, Savage's Station, and Malvern Hill saw some of the most intense fighting of the early war. Despite often winning tactically, McClellan grew increasingly demoralized, convinced he was facing an overwhelming enemy. He became more focused on protecting his flanks than on advancing. The campaign culminated in McClellan's strategic retreat from the gates of Richmond. Despite being numerically superior and having reached within a few miles of the Confederate capital, McClellan withdrew his army to the safety of Harrison's Landing on the James River, essentially giving up on the drive to Richmond. The campaign, which had promised so much, ended in a frustrating and humiliating failure for the Union. The Peninsula Campaign cemented Robert E. Lee's reputation as a brilliant, aggressive, and unpredictable commander. He had, with a smaller force,
successfully defended Richmond against a numerically superior enemy, bolstering Confederate morale and confidence. For the Union, it was a bitter disappointment, raising serious questions about McClellan's leadership and ensuring that the war, far from being over, would continue to rage on with renewed intensity. The capital remained safe, but the cost for both sides was staggering, and the stalemate in the east was far from broken.
Following his stunning success in the Peninsula Campaign, Robert E. Lee, emboldened by victory, decided to take the war to the north. His objective was daring: invade Union territory, gain a decisive victory on northern soil, and perhaps persuade Maryland, a border slave state, to join the Confederacy. A major Confederate victory might even sway European powers like Great Britain and France to officially recognize the Confederate States of America, providing crucial aid. In early September 1862, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac River into Maryland, carrying the hopes of the South with them. However, luck, or perhaps fate, intervened for the Union. A copy of Lee's detailed battle plans, wrapped around 3 cigars, was discovered by Union soldiers on September 13th. This incredible intelligence coup gave General George B. McClellan, once again in command, a clear advantage. Knowing Lee's scattered troop dispositions, McClellan, though still cautious, was finally spurred into action. He moved his much larger Army of the Potomac to intercept Lee. The two armies converged near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. The battle that unfolded on September 17, 1862, would become the single bloodiest day in American history. The fighting began at dawn in a cornfield, where units from both sides exchanged volley after volley at close range, obliterating rows of corn and men alike. The carnage was horrific, with units decimated in minutes. The cornfield became a meat grinder, changing hands multiple times throughout the morning. Later, the fighting shifted to a sunken road, soon to be known as Bloody Lane. Confederate defenders, hidden in the natural trench, inflicted terrible casualties on successive Union assaults. The ground became slick with blood, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. Despite valiant efforts, the Confederates eventually buckled, but only after suffering catastrophic losses. The final desperate phase of the battle took place near a stone bridge, famously defended by a small Confederate force against repeated Union attempts to cross. General Ambrose Burnside's Union Corps finally managed to take the bridge, but by then, Confederate reinforcements, Stonewall Jackson's men who had hurried from Harper's Ferry, arrived to stabilize Lee's shattered line. By dusk, the fighting finally ceased. Neither side had achieved a decisive victory, but Lee's invasion had been checked. The battle was, in strategic terms, a Union victory, as Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. But the cost was staggering. Over 23,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in just one day. The fields around Antietam Creek were literally covered with dead and dying men, a horrifying testament to the brutality of modern warfare. For President Lincoln, Antietam, though not a complete triumph, provided the crucial moment he had been waiting for. With the Union having averted a major disaster on home soil, Lincoln seized the opportunity to fundamentally change the character of the war. On September 22, 1862, just days after the battle, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that if the Confederate States did not return to the Union by January 1, 1860, all enslaved people in those rebellious territories would be declared free. This monumental decree transformed the war from merely a fight to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. It galvanized abolitionists, discouraged European intervention, as supporting the Confederacy would now mean supporting slavery, and laid the groundwork for a new, more profound conflict for human freedom. The blood spilled at Antietam not only stemmed a Confederate invasion, but also washed away the ambiguity of the war's purpose, making it irrevocably a fight for a new birth of freedom. The grand strategies and roaring cannons of Antietam faded,
But for the hundreds of thousands of men in the Union blue and Confederate gray, the war was a grinding, relentless, daily reality. Away from the headlines, a soldier's life was a brutal cycle of boredom, discomfort, and sudden, terrifying violence. I imagine the monotonous rhythm of the march, miles covered under a scorching sun or through freezing rain, heavy packs digging into shoulders, the rhythmic scuff of thousands of boots turning dusty roads into muddy quagmires. Food was often scarce and monotonous. Hardtack, a brick-hard biscuit, sometimes infested with weevils, formed the backbone of the Union diet, supplemented by salt pork, coffee, and whatever could be scrounged. Confederate rations were often far worse, especially as the war progressed and the blockade tightened. Hunger was a constant companion for many, particularly in the Southern ranks. Fresh water was a luxury, and men often drank from contaminated streams, setting the stage for disease. And disease was the true silent killer. For every soldier who died on the battlefield, 2 or 3 succumbed to sickness. Measles, mumps, typhoid, dysentery. These invisible enemies swept through crowded, unsanitary camps like wildfire. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Surgeons, often overwhelmed, performed amputations without anesthesia in crude field hospitals. The cries of the wounded, the smell of gangrene, the flies buzzing around makeshift tents, these were common horrors, far more frequent than the glory of battle. Yet amidst the hardship, an unbreakable camaraderie formed. Men from vastly different backgrounds, farmers, laborers, clerks, teachers, forged bonds stronger than blood. They shared their meager rations, huddled together for warmth, nursed each other through sickness, and faced death side by side. Laughter, songs, card games, and letters from home provided fleeting moments of normalcy and a vital connection to the world they'd left behind. The mail was a lifeline, bringing news of loved ones, but also the agonizing grief of loss. Letters were a common sight in camp. Soldiers, often barely literate, painstakingly wrote to wives, mothers, and sweethearts, trying to convey the unimaginable realities of their existence, while simultaneously reassuring their families of their well-being. These were often a soldier's only solace, a tangible link to a life that felt increasingly distant. Discipline, though strict, sometimes faltered under the immense strain. Desertion was a persistent problem on both sides, driven by hunger, disease, homesickness, or the sheer horror of combat. Men simply walked away, vanishing into the vast landscape, often risking severe punishment if caught. Yet for every deserter, hundreds more stayed, driven by loyalty to their comrades, their cause, or simply a grim determination to see it through. The daily routine was broken by periods of intense boredom, followed by moments of sheer terror. The sudden scream of a shell, the whistling of mini A-balls, the chilling rebel yell or Union huzzah, these sounds transformed ordinary men into fighters, forcing them to confront their deepest fears. A soldier's life was a testament to human endurance, a constant reminder that the grand ambitions of generals and presidents were ultimately carried on the tired, aching shoulders of ordinary men, far from the comfort and safety of home. The spring of 1863 brought renewed Confederate confidence in the East. After his stunning victory at Chancellorsville, where he outmaneuvered a larger Union army, though tragically losing Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee decided on another bold gamble, a second invasion of the North. His objectives were ambitious: relieve pressure on Vicksburg in the west, gather supplies from Pennsylvania's rich farmlands, and most importantly, achieve a decisive victory on Union soil that would break Northern morale, strengthen the anti-war movement, and perhaps even secure European recognition for the Confederacy. In early June, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, nearly 75,000 strong, began its march north. The Union command, meanwhile, was in turmoil. Just days before the battle, President Lincoln, frustrated with General Hooker's performance, replaced him with Major General George G. Meade as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade, a less flamboyant but more steady officer, immediately set about organizing his roughly 90,000 men to intercept Lee. The two massive armies, almost blindly, converged on the small market town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The battle erupted on July 1, 1863. Confederate forces, arriving first, pushed Union cavalry and infantry through the town and onto the hills south of Gettysburg. By the end of the day, Union forces, though forced to retreat, had established a strong defensive line on Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, forming a formidable fishhook shape. Lee, confident after his initial success, ordered his generals to continue the attack the next day. July 2nd brought the true inferno. Lee launched massive assaults on both flanks of the Union line. On the Union left, desperate, bloody fighting raged in iconic locations like the Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. Union soldiers, notably the 20th Maine under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, held their ground against overwhelming odds, their heroic defense of Little Round Top preventing Lee from outflanking the Union position. On the Union right, fierce battles raged around Culp's Hill as Confederates tried to break through the Union defenses. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand, driven by sheer grit and desperation, claiming tens of thousands of lives. July 3rd dawned with an ominous quiet, quickly shattered by the heaviest artillery barrage of the war. Lee, still believing he could break the Union center, ordered Pickett's charge, a direct frontal assault by some 12,500 Confederate infantrymen across open fields towards the heavily fortified Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It was a magnificent, yet suicidal spectacle of military courage and tragic futility. Union artillery and rifle fire tore through the advancing ranks. Men fell by the thousands, their brave charge turning into a bloody massacre. Only a handful reached the Union lines before being overwhelmed or captured. Pickett's charge was the high watermark of the Confederacy. It was the moment their best efforts crashed against an unbreakable Union resolve. Lee's army, shattered and demoralized, began its long, painful retreat back to Virginia on July 4th. The Battle of Gettysburg had claimed between 46,000 and 51,000 casualties from both sides over 3 days, making it the bloodiest single battle of the war. For the Union, it was a pivotal victory, stopping Lee's invasion and crushing the Confederacy's hopes of winning the war on Northern soil or securing foreign recognition. Gettysburg, coupled with the fall of Vicksburg in the West on the same day, marked the definitive turning point of the American Civil War, shifting the strategic initiative irrevocably to the Union. The path to ultimate Union victory, though still long and agonizing, now seemed clear. While the roar of cannons echoed across the fields of Gettysburg in the east, a grinding, brutal campaign was reaching its crescendo in the west. For the Union, securing the Mississippi River was paramount to victory. It was the Confederacy's economic artery, a vital transport route for troops and supplies, and a symbolic backbone of their nation. Control of the entire river would split the Confederacy in two, effectively isolating Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, and standing as the last Confederate stronghold guarding the river was Vicksburg, Mississippi, a formidable fortress perched atop bluffs, earning it the nickname Gibraltar of the Confederacy. For months, Major General Ulysses S. Grant had been obsessed with taking Vicksburg. His earlier attempts had been thwarted by the rugged terrain, stubborn Confederate defense, and logistical nightmares. But Grant, a man of relentless determination, refused to be deterred. He tried various approaches, digging canals, attempting to bypass the city, and launching direct assaults. Each failed, often with heavy losses, but Grant learned from every setback. In the spring of 1863, Grant devised his most audacious plan yet. He marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, while Admiral David Dixon Porter's Union gunboats daringly ran the gauntlet of Vicksburg's powerful batteries at night, suffering heavy fire but successfully getting below the city. This brilliant combined operation allowed Grant to cross the river south of Vicksburg, effectively outflanking the Confederate defenses. Once across, Grant abandoned his supply lines and launched a bold, lightning-fast campaign. His army moved rapidly, living off the land, defeating Confederate forces in several smaller but crucial battles, preventing them from uniting to relieve Vicksburg. By May 1863, he had completely encircled the city, trapping Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton's Confederate army inside. The siege of Vicksburg began. Grant initially tried direct assaults, hoping to overwhelm the Confederate defenses, but these proved costly failures against Vicksburg's well-entrenched earthworks and determined defenders. Realizing the futility of further direct attacks, Grant settled into a protracted siege. Union artillery relentlessly pounded the city day and night. Confederate soldiers and civilians alike sought refuge in caves dug into the bluffs, enduring constant shelling, dwindling rations, and the gnawing agony of hunger. As weeks turned into more than 40 days, conditions inside Vicksburg became desperate. Food became critically scarce. Residents and soldiers were reduced to eating mules, dogs, rats, and even ground-up pea flour mixed with cornmeal. Disease was rampant, and morale plummeted. The relentless pressure from Grant's army, coupled with the slow strangulation of hunger, finally broke the city's will. On July 4, 1863, the very same day that Lee's defeated army began its retreat from Gettysburg, Pemberton's starving Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrendered to Grant. It was a monumental victory for the Union. Over 30,000 Confederate soldiers were captured, and the Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River. The Confederacy was literally cut in two, severing vital supply routes and isolating its western territories. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg, marked the undeniable turning point of the Civil War. The Confederacy had suffered two crippling blows on successive days, from which it would never fully recover. The long, bloody path to Union victory was now clear, defined by Grant's unyielding pressure in the West and the shifting momentum in the East. The Anaconda Plan was working, and the Confederacy's resources were slowly but surely being drained away. The dual victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 irrevocably shifted the tide of the war. Yet, despite these monumental successes, President Lincoln remained frustrated by the Union's inability to deliver a knockout blow in the East. His commanders there seemed unable to decisively defeat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The war, though now leaning towards the Union, was far from over, and its cost in lives and resources continued to mount at a horrifying rate. Lincoln knew he needed a commander who could match Lee's audacity with relentless aggression, a general who wouldn't hesitate or become bogged down by caution. His eyes turned westward to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and especially Vicksburg showcased a general who understood the true nature of modern warfare. That victory often required continuous pressure, a willingness to accept casualties, and an unyielding determination to pursue and destroy the enemy's main force. While other generals were worried about their supply lines, Grant was focused on the enemy. In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and made him general-in-chief of all Union armies. It was a clear mandate. Grant was now in charge of the entire war effort. His strategy was simple, yet revolutionary for the time. Use the Union's overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority to exert constant synchronized pressure on the Confederacy across all fronts. No longer would Union armies operate independently. They would move in concert, preventing the Confederates from shifting troops from one theater to another to reinforce threatened areas. Grant set up his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, directly confronting Lee in Virginia, while his trusted subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, was given command of the Western armies with orders to drive deep into the Confederacy. This new coordinated approach signaled a fundamental shift towards total war. not just fighting enemy armies, but destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight. This meant targeting their infrastructure, their railroads, their factories, and their food sources. For the South, their strategic dilemma deepened. They were fighting a defensive war, outnumbered and out-resourced. Robert E. Lee, despite his genius, was perpetually on the defensive, forced to react to Union initiatives. His strategy became one of attrition, hoping to inflict such heavy casualties on the Union that Northern public opinion would turn against the war, forcing Lincoln to negotiate a peace. But Grant understood this and was prepared to pay the terrible price. The stage was set for a brutal climactic year of fighting. Grant would personally face Lee in the East, initiating the Bloody Overland Campaign, a series of battles designed to grind down Lee's army. Simultaneously, Sherman would embark on his devastating march through the heart of the South. This new era of coordinated, relentless warfare, guided by Grant's iron will, promised to bring the war to a decisive, if agonizingly costly, conclusion. The struggle for leadership and strategy had found its resolution in the Union's determined pursuit of victory, no matter the cost.
While Grant engaged Lee in a grinding war of attrition in Virginia, his trusted subordinate, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, was poised to execute a revolutionary and terrifying strategy in the Confederacy's heartland. Sherman's objective was not just to defeat enemy armies, but to break the South's will to fight by destroying its capacity to wage war. This was the dawn of total war, a concept that would forever change the nature of conflict. In September 1864, after a grueling campaign that culminated in the capture of Atlanta, a vital Confederate railway hub and industrial center, Sherman prepared for his next audacious move. He cut off his supply lines, burned much of Atlanta, and on November 15, 1864, began his infamous March to the Sea. His army of 62,000 men, organized into two wings, swept through Georgia, covering a front 60 miles wide. The march was less a traditional military campaign and more a calculated act of destruction. Sherman's orders were clear. His troops were to live off the land, foraging for food and supplies, but also to destroy anything that could aid the Confederate war effort. This meant tearing up railroads, Sherman's neckties, burning cotton gins and mills, destroying supply depots, and raiding plantations. While private homes were generally spared, anything of military value was fair game, and often the line between military and civilian property blurred. The psychological impact of the march was immense. For Southerners, it was an unprecedented invasion, a terrifying demonstration of the Union's power and ruthlessness. Civilians fled in terror. Slaves often abandoned plantations to follow the Union Army, seeing them as liberators. The sight of Union columns marching unopposed through the heart of the Confederacy, leaving a swath of desolation in their wake, shattered morale and fueled a desperate sense of hopelessness. The Confederacy's internal weaknesses, its reliance on external trade, its decentralized structure, its inability to protect its own citizens, were brutally exposed. Sherman's march, though controversial for its destruction, achieved its strategic goals with remarkable efficiency. It inflicted an estimated $100 million in damage, equivalent to billions today, crippling the South's economy and infrastructure. It tied up Confederate forces, preventing them from reinforcing Lee in Virginia. More importantly, it broke the spirit of the Southern people, demonstrating that their government could not protect them, and that the war would continue until their complete surrender. On December 21, 1864, Sherman's army reached the coast and captured Savannah, Georgia, seizing vast amounts of supplies and effectively ending the first phase of his devastating campaign. He famously wired Lincoln, offering him, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. The march to the sea was a grim, brutal, but strategically decisive triumph.
signaling that the Union would stop at nothing to end the war. The Confederacy was being strangled, starved, and systematically broken from within, making its ultimate collapse inevitable. As General Sherman carved his path of destruction through Georgia, Ulysses S. Grant, now General-in-Chief, directly confronted Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the Eastern Theater. Grant knew that to win the war, he had to destroy Lee's army, not just capture Richmond. Beginning in May 1864, he launched the Overland Campaign, a relentless series of battles that would be unprecedented in their ferocity and continuous combat. This was not about grand maneuvers. It was about a brutal, head-on collision, a war of attrition where the Union's superior numbers and resources would slowly, agonizingly grind down the Confederacy. The campaign began in the dense, tangled undergrowth of the wilderness in early May. The terrain made traditional tactics impossible. Visibility was limited, units became disoriented, and the fighting quickly devolved into a chaotic, blind struggle. Forests caught fire from muzzle flashes and artillery shells, burning wounded men alive. It was a hellish, disorienting experience. Despite heavy Union casualties, Grant did not retreat, a stark contrast to previous Union commanders. Instead, he simply moved around Lee's flank and pressed south, forcing Lee to react. The next major engagement was the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Here, the fighting centered on a bloody salient known as the Mule Shoe, a sharp bend in the Confederate lines. For nearly 20 hours, Union and Confederate soldiers engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat, often fighting over the same trenches. It was a prolonged, savage struggle unlike anything seen before, a grim foreshadowing of the trench warfare that would define future conflicts. The fighting was so intense that trees were cut down by musket fire. Again, Grant absorbed horrific losses but refused to disengage. After days of brutal combat, he simply disengaged and moved south again, forcing Lee to follow. Grant's grim determination was encapsulated in his famous message, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." His objective was clear: keep constant pressure on Lee, preventing him from resting, reorganizing, or maneuvering. The losses were staggering for both sides. The Union was losing men at an alarming rate, drawing heavy criticism back home, but the Confederacy, with its dwindling manpower, could far less afford its casualties. The campaign culminated in the disastrous Union assault at Cold Harbor in early June. Believing Lee's lines were weak, Grant ordered a massive frontal assault that resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Union, with thousands of casualties in just minutes. Even Grant later admitted he regretted the attack. Yet, even after this setback, Grant did not retreat. Instead, he made a daring night march to the south, crossing the James River to strike at Petersburg, a vital railroad hub south of Richmond. The failure to capture Petersburg quickly led to the Siege of Petersburg, a grinding, 9-month trench warfare struggle that trapped Lee's army. It was a static, brutal conflict of raids, sharpshooters, and constant shelling, with lines of fortifications stretching for miles around the two cities. Grant was systematically cutting off Lee's supply lines and slowly but surely squeezing the life out of the Confederate capital and its last remaining army. The Overland Campaign had been a meat grinder, costing the Union dearly, but it had achieved its primary goal. It had pinned Lee's army, ensuring that the Confederacy's last major field army would be systematically bled dry. The end, though still agonizingly slow, was now inevitable. For 9 grueling months, the siege of Petersburg had been a living hell, which created strategy of constant pressure had trapped Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a network of trenches stretching for miles around Petersburg and extending to the Confederate capital, Richmond. The once proud city, the heart of the Confederacy, had become a besieged symbol, its defenses strained to the breaking point. Supplies were scarce, morale was plummeting, and the grim reality of impending defeat loomed over every starving soldier and weary civilian. Grant, with his superior numbers and an unwavering resolve, continued to extend his lines, meticulously stretching Lee's already thin defenses thinner and thinner. Each extension meant more Confederate troops were needed to cover the ever-growing front, further depleting their ranks. Lee, always brilliant in defense, was running out of men, food, and options. His army, though still fiercely loyal, was starving, exhausted, and hopelessly outnumbered. The decisive moment came on April 2, 1865. After a series of fierce engagements and a successful Union breakthrough at Five Forks the previous day, Grant launched a massive, coordinated assault along the entire Petersburg line. The weakened Confederate defenses, stretched beyond their breaking point, finally collapsed. Union troops poured through the breaches, taking thousands of prisoners and signaling the end. News of the breakthrough reached Richmond that Sunday. President Jefferson Davis was attending church when he received the urgent dispatch from Lee. Petersburg could no longer be held, and Richmond must be evacuated immediately. The capital, which the Confederates had defended so fiercely for years, was now irrevocably lost. Chaos erupted. Government officials, civilians, and soldiers scrambled to flee, loading what few possessions they could onto trains and wagons, desperate to escape before the Union Army arrived. To prevent the vast stores of military supplies and public buildings from falling into Union hands, Confederate authorities ordered that warehouses and armories be set ablaze. However, the fires quickly spread out of control, fueled by high winds and ignited by looting and general disorder. Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, became an inferno, its streets filled with thick smoke, the screams of the trapped, and the roar of uncontrolled flames. The symbol of Southern independence was consuming itself in a fiery, apocalyptic end. On April 3, 1865, Union troops led by African-American soldiers marched into the smoldering ruins of Richmond. They extinguished the fires, restored order, and raised the Stars and Stripes over the Confederate Capitol building. President Lincoln himself visited the fallen city days later, walking its devastated streets, a poignant symbol of the Union's victory and the immense cost of the war. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee, with the shattered remnants of his once invincible Army of Northern Virginia, desperately tried to escape the pursuing Union forces. He hoped to link up with General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina, but Grant's relentless pursuit, cutting off every escape route, left him with nowhere to go. The fall of Richmond was not just the loss of a city, it was the final, crushing blow to the Confederacy's will to continue the fight, signaling that the end of the war was finally, agonizingly, at hand. With Richmond in Union hands and his lines of retreat cut off, Robert E. Lee's options vanished. His once mighty Army of Northern Virginia, now a skeletal force of fewer than 30,000 men, starving and exhausted, was relentlessly pursued by Ulysses S. Grant's overwhelming forces. After a final desperate attempt to break through Union lines at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, Lee realized the futility of further bloodshed. The time for fighting was over. On that somber Sunday, Lee, impeccably dressed in a pristine gray uniform, rode to the home of Wilmer McLean in Appomattox Courthouse. There he met with a mud-splattered Ulysses S. Grant, who wore a simple private's uniform with his general's shoulder straps. The contrast between the two men symbolized the vast differences between their armies and their nations. Grant, ever magnanimous in victory, offered generous terms of surrender. Confederate soldiers could return home after laying down their arms, keeping their horses and mules for spring planting, and officers could retain their sidearms. No soldier would be prosecuted for treason. The surrender ceremony 2 days later was a poignant spectacle. Union soldiers, witnessing the ragged, emaciated Confederate ranks marching to lay down their tattered flags and rusted weapons, spontaneously began to cheer. Grant, however, immediately silenced them, ordering his men to salute their defeated foes as a gesture of respect.
The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse marked the effective end of the American Civil War. The news of Appomattox swept across the nation like a cleansing storm, bringing immense relief and jubilation to the North and a grim, resigned peace to the devastated South. But the nation's profound sorrow was not yet over. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was tragically assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The architect of Union victory, the man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour, would not live to see the peace he had so desperately sought. His death plunged the North into mourning and left a dangerous void in the leadership needed to heal the fractured nation. The Civil War, lasting 4 long years, was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Over 620,000 Americans died, more than in all other American wars combined until the Vietnam War. Millions more were wounded, and vast swaths of the South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its social structure irrevocably transformed. The war ended slavery, finally fulfilling the promise of liberty for millions of African Americans, though the struggle for true equality would continue for another century. The Union was preserved, forever reaffirming the principle that states could not secede. The war forged a stronger, more centralized federal government and paved the way for America's rise as an industrial power. But it also left deep, festering wounds of resentment, grief, and racial animosity that would plague the nation for generations through the era of Reconstruction and beyond. The Civil War fundamentally reshaped the United States, defining what it meant to be an American. It was a brutal, necessary baptism by fire that forged a new nation, tragically united by the very conflict that had nearly torn it apart. The scars of a divided nation would forever remain, a permanent reminder of the immense cost of freedom and unity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to endure, to suffer, and ultimately to rebuild.